The nervous system is a network of cells that we have in our bodies, and these are cells that are very specialized for being able to communicate. And the brain is the central location where we make conscious decisions about communication with our bodies, right? We can decide to move muscles, for example, but there's also a lot of just automatic communication and signaling that goes on. The cells that allow us to do this are called neurons. Neurons are very specialized cells, and there are different types of neurons throughout the body, but we're just going to learn about sort of a typical neuron. A typical neuron has 3 different regions. It has a cell body, like we're familiar with. It has a nucleus inside of a cell body, but then it has some really specialized projections that reach off from that cell body. So look at all of these little projections over here. These are called dendrites. Dendrites are specialized for receiving incoming signals. And then there's this other really long projection. This is called an axon. This is the part of the neuron that is specialized for sending signals in the outwards direction. So if this cell decides to signal another, it's going to send that signal down this axon, and then there would be a neighbor cell nearby that would receive that signal. So dendrites and axons, these carry signals. And if you'll notice, there's also it's labeled a myelin sheath. What this is a layer of insulation wrapped around the axon, and this is the same idea if any of you are familiar with like electrical cables. A large part of the reason why they have a plastic wrapping around the outside is because it really speeds up how quickly the signal can be sent. So this insulation, it really helps to speed up the signal. So think about a leg. Okay, so in order to send a signal down to your foot, to move your foot, what has to happen is a neuron carries that signal all the way from your spinal cord down your leg to your foot. That's actually one cell that carries the signal that whole way. Amazing, right? That's a really long axon that's carrying that signal. And when you decide to move your leg, it's not like you have to think about it and then wait a few seconds. It pretty much happens instantaneously. And that's in large part because of this, this insulation that we have, the myelin sheaths around the axons. The nervous system is organized. It's extremely organized. It has 2 different major sections, 2 different major components. In pink here in this picture, this is called the central nervous system. It's right down the center of the body. That includes the brain and the spinal cord. And then we also have all these branches off to the side. And in blue, this is what makes up the peripheral nervous system. Peripheral means kind of on the sides. So anyway, in either case, the signals are sent kind of in that same way through the use of dendrites and axons. The brain, let's just make some notes about the brain. The brain has some very specialized regions. The very front section of the brain, front and top, is called the cerebrum. I'll just park my laser pointer on it. This up here, this is the cerebrum. This is where we have conscious thought. This is where we're able to think about things, make conscious decisions, decide to move our arms or legs. This is also where our personality seems to reside, is in more of the front section of the brain. This is also the region of the brain where we process emotion, where emotions originate from. That's a very complex system. Okay, so in addition to the cerebrum, there are also other sections lower down and more towards the middle of the brain. The hypothalamus, this is pretty much right at the very center, right underneath where my laser pointer is right now. The hypothalamus helps to give us a sense of time. It also helps to regulate hormone production throughout the body. So say you need some, I don't know, maybe you're in a situation where you need some adrenaline to get going. The hypothalamus is pretty key in initiating that process. So yeah, hypothalamus, pretty automatic. It's not something you have to consciously think about. Right beneath that would be the brainstem. The brainstem is responsible for a lot of automatic functions, like monitoring the heart rate, how quickly is the heart beating. It facilitates your breathing when you're not consciously thinking about it. That's the brainstem. And then one more section right here in the back, this is called the cerebellum. It kind of hangs down on the back of the brain. The cerebellum This helps to coordinate body movements. So say, I don't know, if you want to touch your nose, that's actually a very complex thing. You have to contract muscles in your arm, but you also have to coordinate that movement with what's going on in your hand. And all that coordination, in large part, is facilitated by what the cerebellum is doing. Helps us with awareness of where we are in space. Let's talk about how signals are transmitted in the nervous system. How do these signals go? So we've said that they are transmitted down these axons. They carry signals. How do those signals go? They're transmitted through what are called action potentials. In an action potential, there has to be some kind of a triggering event in order to get it started. This could be something like maybe someone pokes your arm, that mechanically deforming your skin locally. What that'll do is it'll stretch the plasma membrane of the neuron, and that causes, just right there locally, it causes some channels to open up in the membrane. So now ions can pass through. Sodium ions and potassium ions, they're very prevalent around all of our cells actually. So these ions are just always kind of hanging out. All right, so initially those ions will flood inwards, and what happens is that results in a change to the conditions of these neighbors. All right, so imagine a positive charge moves in. Well, now we've just changed the electrostatic configuration near proteins that are in the membrane right here. The proteins that are in the membrane are going to change shape accordingly. Okay, so just imagine you bring a positive charge up, it's going to make other charges move. Some of them will be attracted, some of them will be repelled. So what ends up happening is the neighbors then open their channels, neighbor channels open up, and then we'll have charges that'll flood in right there. Meanwhile, this one kind of returns to normal. Okay, so, but let's continue on. So this charge just rushed in. That's going to cause its neighbors to do the same thing. So it ends up being propagated like a wave down the axon. You don't need to know the details of that. This is mostly for informational purposes. It's fascinating how this works. It ends up being kind of like a domino effect. And once you get the first domino going, it automatically will propagate on down the line. And that's action potentials doing that. Once the signal makes it down to the end of the axon, there has to be a way to transmit the signal to the next cell in line. So maybe this is a muscle, maybe it's another neuron. Somehow the signal needs to be transmitted across the gap between neighbor cells. And this space right here, this location where there's a connection between two cells, this is called a synapse. And what happens when the action potential makes it down here to the end is that the vesicles that are right here at the end, those vesicles are triggered to fuse with the membrane. These vesicles are carrying molecules called neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitters will diffuse across this gap called a cleft, and the neurotransmitters will bind to the receiving cell. That will cause an ion channel to open in the receiving cell, and that starts up a whole new wave of an action potential. So the signal overall, it started off as an electrical signal. It was based on the movement of charges. And then right here it gets converted to a chemical signal across the gap, and then it converts back to an electrical signal. So this is amazing, the way that cells can message each other. It's amazing, and it's also quite complex. This is how muscles can be activated. If you decide to move a muscle, then a signal is sent down a neuron to a muscle cell. A muscle would be the cell that picks up that signal from a neurotransmitter. And on that note, let's just finish up by talking about muscles a little bit. Muscle cells have a really unique structure. Muscle cells are very elongated. They're kind of like long fibers. And embedded inside of the cell, there are these special proteins, protein fibers. They're really long, and they're laid out in a kind of an overlapping pattern. They overlap. Let me point to my slide down here. So what we're looking at, this is a zoom in of a muscle. Here's a muscle. Let's just zoom in and look at this one cell. This is one cell that we're looking at here. Okay, so this cell has bundles of fibers inside of it. And when we look at these fibers that are bundled up, If we zoom in to really, really high magnification, this would take an electron microscope to see, but what we would see is a pattern like this. There are filaments of actin in purple, and separately there are filaments of myosin shown in pink. These are the two filaments that are really key for muscles to function. What happens when a muscle contracts is these fibers, they kind of ratchet against each other, they slide against each other, and this whole thing would shorten as a result of that. So imagine the purple fibers here, imagine they slide to the right, and imagine these purple fibers slide to the left. All right, the whole thing is going to shorten, and that leads to contraction overall. If all of the fibers in this muscle do that at the same time, then this whole muscle is going to shorten, and that's how you can move your arms and legs. Okay, so when you contract your bicep muscle right here, it shortens that tissue, and consequently the rest of your arm is kind of swung up into position. So that's a little bit of how muscles work. We're not going to be lecturing on senses. We will be investigating senses in lab, but we're not going to be covering it separately in lecture. The lab does a very good job of walking through some of the key senses and how they work, and that all ties into the nervous system. So we'll just go based off of lab for that.